Okay, so we're ready to go.
Yep, you are ready to go.
Okay, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be talking about something we already mentioned a few months ago, classical elements and syntax. Syntax really means the way the parts are ordered together, the classical orders, the Greek orders versus Roman orders. We'll have just kind of a little review/refresher about some of the orders. Here's just kind of a brief outline with some learning outcomes. Understanding Doric order misconceptions. We'll talk about the Temple of the Winds, which we haven't seen in class before, the columnar-base relationship, the Baroque Pediment, the curved portico, and of course, specifically, what's interesting is architectural illiteracy, which is a common dynamic in contemporary classical architecture, prominently in American culture, which is interesting and a little bit disturbing. So I'm just going to show you. Last week we talked about the Beaux-Arts School, the École des Beaux-Arts. We talked about the Rome Prize. This is such a fascinating imaging. When I was a student, I couldn't figure out what I thought. This was just kind of a fantasy rendering. But when you won the Rome Prize after you graduated from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, you would apply for this incredible competition. And what this means is that as a student or a scholar, you would actually go to ancient Rome and you would literally physically measure the dimensions and, of course, the buildings. So this is a rendering depicting one of the students from the Prix de Rome Prize. This is probably back in the 1700s, but there were people on ladders measuring the original columnar orders. So what you would do is you would come to the Roman Forum or parts of Rome. You would spend years and measure some of these buildings to actually reconstruct what the buildings would really look like when they were first built, because we didn't have cameras back then. So everything was relied on what was written down, drawn, sketched, and rendered. Again, if you're an archaeologist or an architecture scholar, you could figure out the parts of the facade, the plan, and reconstruct the entire building based on measurements. I thought it was a wonderful watercolor showing that people were actually on ladders measuring these things. Just remarkable, a little bit scary to do, but that's how things were done back then. So we look at reconstruction renderings of Rome. These were manually done. Let's just kind of have a quick review of some of the stuff we talked about, if not last year or several months ago. Again, in Renaissance, we established the 5 canons or the 5 orders, the classical orders: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. It's really fun. There's one exception. There's an addition. I'm not sure if any sort of scholar has incorporated this, but it's called the Temple of the Winds order, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for the most part, when we start observing and drawing and designing with the classical language, is that the common dynamic and rule that has to be honored is the relationship of the architrave, the frieze, relative to the column. So this diagram shows the red bars show that 99% of the time in classical art, true classicism is that the frieze and the architrave, of course, if you see the architrave, you see my cursor, the architrave is the main beam that holds, of course, what's called the triglyphs, the metapiece, or the frieze above that. Everything is aligned with the neck of the column. That's really important to remember that. We'll talk about the Temple of the Winds in just a little bit. So if you look at all these orders, you can clearly see that the beam, the entire entablature, of course, which houses the entablature, houses the architrave, the frieze, the cornice, is aligned always with the neck of the columns. Remember that. And when you're sketching, when you're observing classical orders, this is how it is properly done. And what I was saying earlier is that, pretty much the height of the columns is based on each diameter. So in other words, the diameters start increasing by which order you're actually designing or choosing. So of course, the Doric order has 8, Ionic has 9, the Corinthian has 10, so on and so forth. So let's take a look at when you violate that rule and when you start incorporating what's called architectural illiteracy. Here is a very dreadful attempt at trying to recreate the classical orders in a professional language. There's really nothing. They're not following any sort of order. They're not really relying on the ancient rules established from the classical orders. Obviously, the pediment is way too large. It projects way far above the neck, and of course, the parts of the entablature are missing. There's no frieze. You can just see that the proportion of everything is completely distorted. And I'll give you the location of these buildings a little bit later in the lecture, but you can clearly see that the classical language has been violated in terms of making it blatantly ugly. Earlier in the class, remember, the definition of beauty is defined by relationships. It's related to the way that the column and the frieze relate to each other, and of course the pediment. Clearly, the frieze around this portico projects way too far above, outside the boundaries of the columnar order, which of course renders it very kind of a very clumsy, overscaled portico building. Also, if you look at the rest of the cornice on the main building, the frieze and entablature and of course the architrave is completely missing. It's a very sort of Home Depot sort of I'm calling it a classical architectural cornice misadventure. Parts are missing, parts are blatantly abused by the classical orders. There's really no clear ordering of the way parts are supposed to be arranged. So the syntax has been blatantly violated. And this is a very big problem in American cities because builders are not aware of the understanding of how the classical orders are really supposed to be honored and designed and drawn for. Because part of the mission of the Classical Institute is, of course, to further the appreciation and study of classical architecture. But if you're a classical architect and you do work like this, you really need to go back and understand how they're supposed to be properly designed. So that way the world doesn't look blatantly ugly and misinformed by some of these really kind of these contractors builders that really don't understand the proper language of the classical orders. Okay, so let's take a look at the word pediment. Of course, the pediment is the triangular member above the columns. This is really interesting because classical order has a very serious, specific numbers of dimensions and angles. The angle of the pitch is normally 22.5 degrees. So we're looking at roughly half of a square. Let's take a look at how it's properly done. This is a beautiful facade designed by Jean Gabriel. The Gabriel Prize that I won in 2009 is named after this architect, Jean Gabriel. This is his facade for Place de la Concorde. But you can clearly see that the pediment is honoring that 22.5 degree angle. And of course, the classical orders are very beautifully proportioned with Corinthian. We see the architrave, the main beam, between the column capitals and the frieze. Very carefully proportioned. Okay, so let's talk about, we'll talk about kind of it's a review of the difference between really Greek Doric columns and Roman Doric. I think a lot of people have asked me these questions. You know, how can you possibly tell the difference between a Greek Doric column and of course a Roman Doric column? On the left, you can clearly see that the Greek Doric column and order does not have a base at all. The columns die into the plinth or the top of the steps. So in Roman Doric classical architecture, there is a profile base. So when you start looking at these and identify, you can clearly see the distinction between the Doric base and the Roman base. So obviously in this diagram is that the Doric column does not have a profile base where it meets the steps. In Roman architecture, you can see that there's a curved torus, of course, the little cushion between the bottom of the columns and of course the top of the plinth base. And also, here's a wonderful engraving of the triglyphs and the metope. Of course, the triglyphs are the stylized cross-section of the beams, with, of course, the metope is the square space between each one of the beams. Normally with animal sacrifices, this is a cow skull. You can clearly see this is Roman Doric because, of course, it has a base. The Roman Doric order clearly shows the triglyphs and the metopes expressed onto the frieze. Like this. Again, like this. So in other words, if we go back to the diagrams, you can identify each order because the only order that actually expresses the triglyphs and the metapiece is the Doric order. You would not really see that expressed on Ionic, Corinthian, or Composite. So when you look at a building, you can immediately tell that this building is, of course, Corinthian by the capitals. Of course, you don't show the triglyphs and the metapiece on the frieze. So it's immediately you can start associating that visual relationship with the triglyphs and the metapiece expressed on the frieze. A lot of people were asking in the class or like the last 6 or 7 months or a year, how do you identify a Greek Ionic column versus a Roman Ionic? So the Greek Ionic capital has, of course, the scrolls. They're supposed to be large papyrus rolls that are scrolled up. This is just kind of imaginary setting. But of course, in Greek Ionic, you can see that the span between the volutes is curved and sort of swaying underneath the weight of the drawing rolls at the center. And of course, it's when we get to Roman Ionic, you can see that the scrolls are completely flat at the center between each one of the volutes. It's a very specific, distinctive difference between the two orders. So one is curved and wavy, and the Roman Ionic is, of course, straight and completely flat apart. So let's take a look at one order we really haven't discussed in the class before, and I'm surprised it really hasn't been classified as the 6th order because we talked about the 5 starting from Tuscan and Composite. It's called the Temple of the Winds order. It's the other order. It's part of the Corinthian order, but it's not really Corinthian, which is really interesting. What we're looking at is the capital designed with parts of the acanthus leaves from ancient Greece, and of course, mixed with the lotus leaf. This is really intriguing because here is the original Temple of the Winds. The one on the left is reconstructed in, I think, England. And of course, the one on the right is the original reconstruction drawing of the one in ancient Greece, roughly between 150 BC. This building is actually a very small little temple. It is the Temple of the Winds. Each little facet on the octagonal plan has a sundial, of course, the zodiac symbols. So the order is really adorned with the small little temple fronts with the entrance doorways. Now, this little temple performs many different functions. There's a water clock. It's a way of telling time, temperature. It's an early sort of little meter for all the elements. But we're looking at is a very unique order in ancient Greece, which really hasn't been attributed to any specific classical order. But I think it's been introduced as its own order. So it's called the Temple of the Winds, the Lotus Leaf. Here is the current day situation in ancient Athens. You can see the octagonal plan with, of course, the carving on the frieze. Of course, the columns have completely deteriorated. But here's, of course, what it originally would have looked like. We're looking at a very elegant sort of Corinthian order. We're looking at the lotus leaf mixed with a few of the acanthus leaves. There's a wonderful drawing or engraving of showing the linear elements of the sundial on each one of the faces. But reconstructed in Neoclassicism, you can see how beautiful these columns are. Now keep in mind the proportion of the lotus leaf order or the Temple of the Winds order is the columns are very thin and very elegant. This is an excerpt of the building in my hometown, Sherman, Texas, where I grew up. This is called the Woodman Circled Mansion. It was built in the course of the 1930s as an orphanage, surprisingly built really predominantly by women. And I just thought that was interesting. I'll throw that out during the 30s. There weren't a lot of women architects, designers, constructors, employees. But what's interesting is that you can see the Temple of the Winds, the classical columns are very thin. Now, of course, this by the 1930s, we're using steel and iron. So there's probably is a steel column faced with the cut stone language of the classical orders. Of course, the lotus leaf is adorned on the capitals. So neoclassical architecture, the columns are very thin because we're using steel. It's very delicately wrapped with the cut stone. Of course, unfortunately, this mansion is considered a haunted house. Now it's completely relic of what it used to be the heydays of the 1930s. But the classical language is so beautiful here. I love to go visit this as a ruin. It kind of reminds me of visiting ancient Rome because the entire house is completely falling apart. But we still have this wonderful neoclassical portico. Any guesses as to what house this is? I think you probably saw on the next slide. Any guesses to whose house this actually is? It's a beautiful neoclassical portico with the Temple of the Winds on the capitals. It's Graceland. This is actually Elvis's house. Who would have thought? The king of rock and roll did live in a beautiful neoclassical building. Of course, the proportions are very carefully in honoring roughly the 22.5 or 30-degree pediment angle. We see the classical orders of proportioning the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice is very carefully done. We see the columns from the Temple of the Winds as the capitals. Okay, so when we talk about pediments, it's really the cap of the colonnade. I mentioned this before, we can clearly see the angle is honored in the face of one of these ancient Greek temples. I think this might be the Parthenon in ancient Greece, but pediments, of course, are decorative elements around the window frames, pointed, curved, and broken. Here's really the nomenclature of a classical pediment. We say the raking cornice is, of course, the diagonal angle of the roof is, of course, called the rake. The tympanum is the flat plane between the top of the cornice and, of course, the bottom of the rake profile. Here's an interesting diagram from one of the plates showing the pediments from Greek Ionic, Roman Ionic, which we talked about earlier, and then, of course, Roman Corinthian. The curve is actually a geometric way of drawing and proportioning the actual pediment. Now, the broken pediment on the right is predominantly really from the Mannerist or Baroque period, and of course reintroduced in American architecture during Georgian architecture and early colonial architecture. So here's some very different pediment types. It's interesting, in American architecture, we have these really beautifully curved volutes. Of course, this was probably introduced in, of course, early Georgian architecture in London, then, of course, introduced into American architecture. So broken pediments are really a Mannerist detail. Mannerist architecture is really the period between the Renaissance and the Baroque, primarily the end of Michelangelo's later work, where he starts flipping things over and mixing and breaking the rules together, which we've seen before in the class. This is a wonderful little collage of many different pediments, ranging from simple and severely classical to Baroque, and some very interesting little inflections and inversions of the original form in classical architecture. Let's look at the one in the middle. This is actually the one in the center here. If you can see my cursor, is one of the facades in the Louvre in Paris. What's interesting is that look how tall the frieze is. It's because they're carefully and properly proportioning the ratio of the height of the frieze and architrave based on the Corinthian and composite order. The cornice itself is very thin. Look how very delicate the curved tympanum or the arched pediment is above that. And one thing to keep in mind, if you look at these closely, what I'm talking about in the next few minutes is the relationship of the brackets on the curved and angled pediment on the rake relative to the brackets that occur at the bottom of the cornice. They're all aligned with each other, which I'll talk about in a minute. The same thing with this one. To make the curved pediment and the angular brackets, they have to be sort of parallelograms. Very difficult to construct, but very, very properly proportioned and respectful to the original classical language. And obviously, you know, some of these violate the 22.5 degrees. Some of these are kind of exaggerating for playful and whimsical themes, but we still have the careful proportioning of the classical language of the architrave, the frieze, and of course the cornice. So here's kind of a Mannerist example of architecture. This is Michelangelo, roughly, I think, the late 1500s, 1560, 1570. You can see that this is really the original attempt at breaking, of course, the classical pediment. The square rectangular panel projects up above the middle frieze in the pediment. And if you look at this carefully, Michelangelo was very original at articulating the wall plane with the columns. I've shown this project in the class earlier, but he has a wonderful deliberate way of sort of not poking funs at classical language, but inverting these and creating a very original language and a very exquisite and beautiful language. You know, the wall mass breaks and accepts the paired columns in its own special space for the columns. Of course, normally is the columns taper upwards. He's inverting the little pilasters as a backwards orientation. Is that, of course, the little pilasters taper downwards. So he's kind of inverting the classical orders. Of course, here's a Baroque pediment adorned with sculptures and festoons. And of course, we can clearly see that the brackets are carefully aligned with each other. They're not just randomly placed just because it's an angle. So pediments are really interesting because there's different really imaginative variations on each one of these parts. So we're going to be talking about different views. So this is a wonderful, I think this is by Bernini, San Andre. We see that the pediment is broken by the family crest, and of course it has a curved portico in the front. So let's take a look at, I like to show buildings in my immediate context because I live in Dallas. There's some wonderful classical architecture. This is designed by Mark Lemon Architect. If you're from Dallas or familiar with his work, there's a wonderful book called Crafting Traditions, which is a kind of a biography of all of his work that he did. He did mostly churches and schools, the Dallas area. He was very careful, a very careful neoclassical architect. Let's take a look at brackets with the dental moles. Now remember, the dental moles are the small little, which is a little term for the teeth that's underneath the brackets, underneath the cornice. Let's take a look at the way they're properly supposed to be designed and spaced. So you can obviously see that the brackets from the main underside of the cornice, the horizontal cornice, is still aligned with each one of the brackets on the rake. The inappropriate thing to do in classical architecture is to have them aligned. If you look at this carefully, you can see that the brackets are rotated in line with the rake. That's not proper classical architectural language. They have to be what I'm calling parallelograms. And of course, they're still carefully aligned with the base point of the brackets underneath the cornice. Obviously, you can see this is Roman Ionic because, of course, the scrolls are completely horizontal and flat. This are Greek Ionic, that would be the little papyrus reeds would be curved underneath that. The same thing with all of these. The dentils are still aligned in exactly 90 degrees with, of course, the dentils and the brackets underneath that. The same thing with this one. Of course, the same language with this one. As a sculptor, very difficult because each one of these is a different, well, not size, but a different proportion to carve these out. Of course, the bottom one would be easier, but I'm showing you it's interesting because the entire height of the entablature is carefully honored with the proper proportioning of the composite order. That's why the frieze is so extraordinarily tall in this order. Now, there are some exceptions. Now, just because they're not exactly 90 degrees doesn't mean they're ugly and they're completely ruining the classical order, but the little delicate dentils can violate that rule in a small capacity. Okay, so kind of take a look at mixing the Greek and Roman temple fronts with neoclassical architecture. We're seeing something very new in architecture. Let's take a look at a classical, this is a Roman or Greek Roman temple front with the Corinthian order. This is one of the pavilions at UVA by Thomas Jefferson. We see that the columns start at the ground and of course continue all the way up to the top of the portico or the pediment. Let's take a look at when we start mixing the orders with the neoclassical language. We're seeing kind of a very original heavy masonry base and then the column set on top of that. This makes for a very powerful sort of base because architecture does have a very, classical architecture has a very severe, heavy, grounded base. This is another pavilion at UVA, is that the columnar order sits on top of a heavy masonry base. I'm encouraging everyone to really analyze and looking at each one of the pavilions at the University of Virginia campus, because each one is very uniquely different, but they have a very similar classical language. Each pavilion has their own sort of columnar order, a mixture of Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite. It's a wonderful place where you can see all the language of all the classical orders in one setting. This is just such a great learning tool for classical architecture in any capacity. This is an exquisite facade house designed by Larry Border Architects in Dallas. It's a very elegant composition. Of course, we see the columns are resting on a very heavy masonry base. We see that the structure of it is carefully done. We see the score lines or the joints between the stonework actually honors the proper voussoirs. Of course, the voussoirs are the diagonal structural parts that form the structure of the arch. So again, let's take a look at architectural illiteracy. This is what happens when you don't understand the classical language of proper proportioning or the scale of things. You know, obviously there's no understanding of the fact that the sort of bastardized, well, I guess I could say that in class, is that the frieze and architrave doesn't really follow any sort of proper format or calculation of proportion. Again, the same thing with this one. It's, you know, it's way too top heavy for the columns. Of course, the frieze is missing. The classical orders are not properly designed with the frieze and the architrave. I'm going to share this with you. Now, this is a building on the SMU campus, but I'll show you some true classical architecture buildings that Mark Lemon designed in the early 20s. In just a minute. I just thought that's a really disturbing language, is that you can clearly see how terrible looking that, because now over spending a year with me in the class, you should be able to just identify true classical orders, the proportioning with some sort of modern misunderstood language of the proper orders. We're going to shift to what's called curved porticos. Now, curves in architecture in any capacity, any language, modern, classical, are always difficult to detail and resolve. This is a beautiful little Doric curved portico. Now remember, to properly design curved porticos, or porticos in general, the beam that rests into the wall always has a pilaster or a column underneath it. So let's take a look. This is exquisite early neoclassical mansion, I think, in Virginia. But we can, see that the curved beam always dies into a structural column. That's how they would structurally be supported. And of course, look how elegantly proportioned the height of the frieze is relative to the architrave, and of course the Roman Ionic, because it's Roman Ionic because it has the volutes and it has a profile base. Let's take a look at when the classical orders are not done properly. The good thing is that you can see that the frieze and architrave aligns with the neck of the columns. However, the beam dies into a shutter and there's no pilaster or column to accept the structural load of course, that curved beam. Now, again, you can structurally do this because, of course, the beam dies in probably a wood framing in the wall. But this is just really not how it's properly supposed to be resolved when it meets the actual wall. Here's a beautiful, carefully designed and thoughtful relationship of the curved portico to the wall behind it. A far cry better than what we're looking at here. This is probably designed in the 70s and 80s. This probably is Boston designed in the 17 or 1800s. But we can, see that the shutter bypasses that beautiful transition between the curved portico's beam and, of course, the brick wall. There's enough mass in the brick to accept that structural beam. And of course, it looks more clean and resolved if there is a column or pilaster underneath that relation. Of course, it's nicely proportioned. And of course, the frieze and architrave is aligned with the neck of the column. It's interesting that the astragal, of course, the space between the capital and the shaft, is a little bit further down what we normally see in classical architecture. Look how simple and elegant just the proportion of this Doric portico is. It's not curved, it's very clean and crisp. There's nothing overdone. There's no tricks or there's nothing lying about this. It's a very clean, simple Doric classical order. Okay, now this portico itself is designed carefully and beautifully done just by itself. And by itself, I mean, is that you can see that the frieze, the architrave is carefully proportioned with the diameter of the column. However, the proportion of this portico is way out of scale with this relatively small house. This is a portico that's really designed for a larger house we saw earlier. So the portico in this house really should have been scaled down to about 50% of the size of this. There's really no, it's probably a demand from the client to say, I wanted to have a large front portico, but of course, the architect is thinking it's probably going to violate the proportion of the house as a larger whole. So this is a case where the architectural classical syntax has been violated because the portico is way out of proportion, way out of scale with the house itself. You can see this in a larger full 2 or 3 story neoclassical house like this sort of manner or this caliber. Okay, so again, I'm just going to throw this out. This is, some buildings around. This is such an exquisitely beautiful campus. The SMU campus designed, this is what's called Dallas Hall in, I think, 1915. So we're looking at a true classically ordered Greek or Roman temple front. We see the Corinthian capitals, and of course, a properly scaled proportion pediment with the dome. Of course, this is based on the ancient Pantheon, derived from University of Virginia's campus designed by Thomas Jefferson. Aside from the classical orders, in the early 1900s, we can see that we're using a steel or a cast iron frame for the structure of the dome because, we're really not building with concrete at this time. Of course, here are some of Mark Lemon's other buildings, the Perkins Chapel, we mentioned that earlier. A really interesting language of the curved arch pediment with, of course, the Roman ionic capitals. Of course, we see the heavy neoclassical base, which the columns rest on. This is just an exquisitely, beautifully proportioned facade. Here's what happens when you try to respect the original character of the early 20s neoclassical architecture. It becomes a very bad Xerox of the building across the garden. Unfortunately, this slide is very blurry, but what you can't see is, there's really, to pull work off like this, Mark Lemon already has a clear understanding of the classical language. He references books and studied the proper proportioning. What you can't see is that there's really no distinctive order is the way that things are proportioned in this. Again, it's the same condition as this sort of architectural misadventure and illiteracy. One would think that with all the extraordinary abilities at the SMU campus is that the people that were designing this would have had more foresight into making something a little bit more classically respectful. So when I show these to you, this is just an example. Of course, the pediment is completely the wrong angle. The curved portico is way too out of scale. There's no column or pilaster to accept the beam of the curved portico into the wall behind that. If you look at the rest of the proportions of the cornice on the building itself, the frieze is missing. The cornice is way too out of scale. There's no architrave. There's no frieze. So when I look at these, this is how it's, especially the one on the right, this is how it's properly supposed to be scaled. Now, of course, this is the classical order of the Temple of the Winds, but you can see that the dimension portion of the frieze with the architrave is very carefully done with the classical orders. The one on the left shows that the fascia or the frieze violates the alignment of the neck and the column. I just find it interesting that, the directors of the university hired someone to do classical architecture, and it just kind of slaps the original ones in the face. I'm probably going to get a lot of trouble saying this, but I'm just kind of saying that when it's not carefully, properly done, one of these blatant violations in the true language of architecture. Okay, so I'll just kind of quickly review. This is stuff we talked about early in the class. We talked about syntax, terminology. Again, I'll have this saved as a PDF file. We've talked about this before. We've discussed the proper spacing between the columns by the number in the Doric order, the number of triglyphs that span between each one of the columns. I think I've shown you some of these facades before. Okay, so for our next lecture next week, I'm going to be discussing construction methods and materials. We're going to be revisiting how classical temples were originally supposed to be constructed. Originally, if you remember from the Tuscan order, the temples are actually made out of wood. In ancient Greece and Roman temples, they were actually stylized in stone. But you're going to be seeing how classical architecture is really originally meant to be constructed with brick masonry, of course, primitive tools, iron bars, and masonry. That's all I have for now. I think we have about 15 minutes of questions and comments, and I can go back and stop on each one of the slides for you to comment. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Can you show the slide with the difference between the Greek and Roman door? I think, well, I guess it was the Doric, but can you just go back and show the difference in the columns?
Yeah, this one or
yeah, I wanted to see Ionic. Yes, the one where it's curved for Greek. You said it's curved. If it's curved, it's Greek. If it's straight, it's okay.
Yes.
I mean, I'm trying to take a picture of it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, you will get a PDF of all the PowerPoint presentations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sure. I have a slide of the Greek Doric with no base versus the Roman Doric. You have to imagine this has got to be difficult to construct because there's really no leeway in the columns have to sit exactly flat and horizontal on the base. There's no cushion between the column and, of course, the base it sits on.
Hey,
Jay.
Yes.
I posted a question earlier when you first went over this. This is the perfect slide where the metopes of the Greek order are right on the corner, correct? And then for
Yes.
Roman, there is a bit of a frieze showing. Is that also correct?
Yeah, I think what you're looking at is, I should have mentioned this before, but I was talking about the language of the way that the frieze and the architrave aligns exactly with the neck of the columns.
Yes.
There's one exception to that rule, and this is the 1% of that 99% percentage I talked about, is like in Greek Doric temple fronts, is that you can see the architrave of frieze actually bypasses the neck of the column. That's the only exception, because at this time they weren't able to perfect the relationship of moving the triglyph into where it centers on the column.
Oh yeah, I see that.
You can see that they weren't really sophisticated enough to, well, of course they were extremely sophisticated, but for Roman societies, they were able to move the triglyph to where it's exactly centered with the column. So that way we don't have that sort of overlapping condition that we have in the Greek Doric order. That's really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's
Thanks.
one exception. Yeah. What's interesting is that the capital is actually an elliptical section. In Roman Doric, it's actually a complete semicircular section. Yeah. I think that, personally, I think the Greek capital is a little bit more elegantly done than the Roman Doric, but of course I certainly I don't have work to back it up with this sort of language of detail, but the columns are very simple in this sort of Greek Doric language.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Greek details are much more elegant than the Roman. I guess just because they used a lot of ellipses and much more feminine approach.
But if you look how large and somewhat exaggerated the Roman cornice projects out from the columns.
Mm-hmm.
What's a little bit contradictory is if you look at this image, this is clearly Roman Doric, but what we're looking at is, the architrave is the principal, arch means the highest beam, of course, the beam that has a little mutual is underneath the triglyphs, but this principal beam is so thin. If you look at the Greek section of the Greek entablature, of course, this is the main structural beam. It's much higher in Greek than it is in Roman. And of course, by this time, it's not really the structure of the building, or sort of stylizing the language. But I just thought it was an interesting relationship of the thinness of the architrave in Greek, like this one, like how tall that one is, versus the Roman one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because really in the Etruscan temple, this would be the wooden beams that support the weight of the beams that are above that. So. Has anyone actually been to Graceland? Who would have thought? Elvis must have had really good taste back then. But I think someone else had some other questions.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the Mannerists. You kind of mentioned Michelangelo. So were they mainly defined by kind of the playfulness of how they were breaking the rules of the kind of classical canon?
Yeah, let me go back to that relationship. Yeah, I'm glad you asked it, because we didn't really touch on Mannerist architecture because we shifted from Renaissance to Baroque. But the Mannerist period, because architecture before Michelangelo was somewhat formulaic, it did fit into a very careful classical formula, which means there was very little originality. I don't want to mean violating, but because pretty much architect fit into this. If you look at this slide, is that the classical language was a very specific formula order. But of course, Michelangelo was such an original genius that he started breaking the mold. He literally broke the pediment. You wouldn't see this in either Greek or Roman or Italian Renaissance. You probably would see it in Renaissance architecture. He's really the one that, of course, started flipping things upside down and turning the indices of the columns upside down, and leaving out parts of the cornice are still exquisitely done. But yeah, of course, the Mannerist architecture lent itself to sort of puns, and it's kind of like an early postmodern language, because they were sort of poking fun at classical architecture. Here's what we can do. We can still break the rules, but still make it exquisitely in honor to the original proportioning system established by the ancient Greeks and Romans.
Interesting. So yeah, that's I like thinking of it that way. It's kind of a pre-postmodern movement.
No, it is, and a lot of people think, oh, Michelangelo, he's this kind of tired architect. But if you look at his work carefully, there's so much more going on than just literally reconstructing the classical orders. If you look at all this work, I mean, extremely original and brilliant, because he modifies and changes the classical orders in sort of multiple capacities. Of course, his work is literally more three-dimensional because, of course, he is a sculptor. So his facades have more depth than probably Alberti does, or some of the Renaissance architects. Yeah, clearly. Now this is not Mannerist at all whatsoever. It's clearly carefully done, the classical, ancient Greek and Roman proportion. There's no inflections, there's no parodies, there's no changing the formula at all. It's very true to the original classical language. But honestly, it is just, well, as an architecture major teacher, to visit some of the campuses like the UVA campus and SMU, and when someone does classical work like this, it's just heartbreaking to see this. Well, not heartbreaking, but it is a little bit discouraging because look at how beautiful the real language could actually be if all the buildings, fit into this really carefully done proportioning system that we see here. And I think someone else had some more questions.
Jay, I don't see any questions in the chat or anything.
Okay, I think we have about 5 more minutes. Any other questions or comments?
One more for me. Near the end, you showed us a little porch. I think it was Ionic, maybe? No, Doric. I think it was Doric. It was just a really simple, it didn't have a pitch. It was a flat.
Oh,
little
yes. Yeah. Let me see if I can find that. This one, yes.
Yeah. So on this one, would it have been proper to have a pilaster at the wall?
It would have been, but it's so short that I mean the span of the perpendicular direction is so minimal that I think it's completely fine to leave that out.
Yeah.
What we're looking at is because clearly, if you see, look, the problem with this one is it's such a large scaled curved portico that would need a structural column because it looks terribly unresolved to have the columns there. But this incident is so short that you probably really wouldn't visibly or structurally need a plaster for that portico to die into. But so there's some exceptions, but it would probably look a little bit more finished, but you really wouldn't really need any more structure than that.
Okay.
Well, hopefully, as a designer, you're kind of, looking at these images and the classes and kind of taking them to heart and try to incorporate some of these principles in your work. It will stand out among the other people that don't understand this at all, like especially the difference between the one on the right in this image and of course the one on the left. It's beautiful to an untrained eye on the left, but then when it's properly done, it stands out. And you can visibly associate this as a beautiful, classically proportioned, curved facade. But even this, look how careful and thin that flat pilaster is next to the round column. And also in this image, shutters originally intended were supposed to close the window completely. So probably if you were to shut these 2 leaves, they probably wouldn't have closed the window up. So like in this one, the shutters are wide because of course they divide the window opening in half and they can shut and close. You can clearly see the hinges are actually functional too. Yeah, the same problem with, there's no way the shutters actually close properly, so. Okay, well, Michelle, I think that's all I have for this afternoon.
Okay, great.
I will look
Well,
forward to seeing everyone next Tuesday then.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, bye-bye.
Bye.